We have to my immediate left Chris Donley from CableLabs. So welcome, Chris. We got Chris Luke from Comcast. And we've got Margaret Chiosi from AT&T and Christos Kolias from Orange, Silicon Valley. I've had the pleasure of working with some of these folks prior to being an analyst, being involved with standards over my career with the MEF, IETF, ATM Forum, Frame Relay Forum, so I'm dating myself. But in any case, it's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to an interactive session with the four panelists. So we've got some questions for them, and hopefully there'll be a little time for you folks to ask some questions. So what we'll do is I'll just give you, like I said, a quick perspective, and then we'll open it up to the panelists. I have some questions for them, and there'll be opportunities, hopefully, for you guys to ask some questions as well. So let's, if you know any of you familiar with IDC, you may have heard of us, but we have been talking about the third platform in the ICT space for many years. For the last few years, we went from the mainframe to the distributed client-server model to, the apps world. And I thought it would be useful to kind of put in perspective, the four pillars that we talk about in the third platform: mobility, cloud, social media, and big data. And if you look at all of these, there's some great examples of the role of open source. Obviously, a lot of us are familiar with what Android has done, where 84% of smartphone, according to IDC, have operating systems running Android. You've got big data and what Hadoop has done. Lots of research we've done, over 33% of big data apps are being developed using Hadoop. And then you've got what Facebook and Yahoo and a lot of the companies here in the Valley have created and been using open source for a number of years, Google as well, in the social media world. And finally, if we look into cloud, which kind of touches into networking, and that's an interesting convergence point. As an analyst, I cover that kind of what we call the meet-me points, whether you call it the data center or the convergence of IT and networking. Very, very hot area, very disruptive area. And that's why many of you are here. And OpenStack is playing a key role. I think over 90% of a lot of enterprises are using OpenStack already. It remains to be seen whether it's a platform of choice in the telecom world. So we're entering this application and infrastructure innovation or disruption, and you can see from these slides, we're moving from a horizontal approach to a software-defined model. We're moving towards infrastructure. Why do we need to depend on infrastructure? As Don Blackburn from AT&T correctly said, well, why do I need to depend on the product life cycles of a lot of the traditional vendors? So you're moving into that thing. Why not develop as a community and move into that? Well, object-oriented APIs have made that transformation a lot easier. And you have all these open source initiatives. OpenDaylight is a key one of those, but you have lots of others, and I'll show a couple of examples. So if you look at it, you look at where we are in the middle here, the networking layer, you've got a lot of open source activities that have been going on for a number of years. Obviously, at the compute layer, where a lot of this started, you had Linux, you have Open Power, Open CPU. I'm not going to go into this. You have now newer things even in this area, like containers that Neela mentioned and what Docker is doing with Google. And then in the networking layer, this is where many of us have seen this huge transformation over the last 2 or 3 years, where we have OpenDaylight, OpenFlow, we have OpenNFV, we have Open vSwitch. There's a lot of different examples. And it's really important that, and in the storage, you'll see some survey data I have here in the next couple of slides. The storage area has also been going through a lot of transformation. So the key thing here to look at is that as all of this is changing, the networking is, and sometimes people joke and say we're the last to be moving towards this open source, but I think we have the most profound impact, especially because of all the mobile infrastructure, the Internet of Things, everything that's dependent on the network has a huge impact on everything else. And then, I thought I'd put this up. Certainly, a lot of this has to do with the DevOps culture. A lot of my colleagues at IDC cover IT infrastructure. DevOps in the enterprise is really taking off in a lot of companies, not just large corporations, even mid-sized companies. And this whole agile development approach is also the timing of open source initiatives, as long as agile development, I think, is a good opportunity. OpenStack, again, a lot of activity going on with many of you involved, I'm sure, here. Whether that will become a platform of choice for telco cloud deployments. And then you have other examples. There's many vendors, some of you in the room. Obviously, Brocade was one that I listed here as one of the ones that first commercially deployed an ODL controller. You've got various types of labs. I think Chris will talk about what CableLabs. You've got other open labs going on. And even companies like VMware, which have not necessarily embraced open source, understand that they have to move in that direction with the example that I've listed here they're doing with the OpenStack interface. So obviously IDC does a lot of surveys, and this is just an example of what we did earlier this year in March on the momentum of OpenStack. And again, this is a survey of a large number of users, enterprises across all verticals, including telco. And these are some of the examples of major corporations that are using OpenStack, State University of New York, Bloomberg, American Express, but there's many other examples. And that's an example of, again, open source. Where are you seeing momentum happening? If you look at where is open source being used, and you guys may not be able to read everything, but one thing that's missing, and again, this survey was done earlier this year. Obviously, if IDC is going to do another survey, we probably want to put more networking thing, but networking is so new. But if you look at it, look at 70% of the people surveyed are using open source operating systems, 53% in storage, and then the cloud area. So what I'm trying to, the message I'm trying to, introduce here is that we're all in a common objective here. I think there's a huge momentum shift towards open source by the users, and hopefully you'll hear from some of their viewpoints. So with that, I'm going to grab a seat, and I want to have each of the panelists maybe give a quick 2-3 minute background. Why did they join ODL? Why are you part of the advisory group? What do you see? How does this fit within your organization? And then I'll let you know who. I'm going to ask who wants to go first, or do you want me to pick on one of you? Margaret's got the microphone. Do you want to go first?
That's because I'm not mic'd up because I forgot to go back there. Okay. So Al showed a slide. Actually, I sort of messed it up. He did a very good job going with the flow. We actually have two different types of controllers. We sort of got rid of the term nodal controller. So we have a global controller, we have a local controller. And we actually see OpenDaylight, as you saw there, definitely in the global controller space. And we've actually deployed it. Brian Freeman, who you'll hear tomorrow when he and I talk, actually is the governor, I call it, for our OpenDaylight or our SDN controller development. And we're immersed in using OpenDaylight, and it's our global controller. We're also seeing parts of OpenDaylight. We're going to position it as some of our local controllers. So we're getting into an initiative called, I think it's called Open ROADM, if you're into the optics world. And we're looking at controllers for that. And that we're also looking at ODL, basically our controller. We also have application controllers. And when we started doing evaluation of application controllers, the team wanted to create their own controller because they felt ODL, or what we were building on the network side, was very network focused. They thought Yang models was very network focused. They thought NetConf was very network focused. And actually, we pressed. And when they decided to really look at it, they realized Yang model doesn't really have anything related to networking. It's just a structure. So they're actually now adopting that. And they found that a lot of the problems we were already solving on the network space of orchestration, service orchestration with cloud orchestration with our controllers was actually going to be something very similar that's going to happen in the application controller. So we're actually now starting to build our application controller on OpenDaylight. So that's one of the bigger reasons why we joined ODL and became a user and so forth, because we are building a lot on this platform.
Okay. Chris, Luke, Chris, I know Comcast recently also joined ODL, and now you're also part of the advisory group. Share us some of your perspectives of why you're part of this group. And
I mean, some of the history resonates. I mean, we've been using OpenDaylight in whole or in part since its first announcement. Bits and pieces, experimental. It was obviously quite immature when it started, but things always start from humble groups. But as we started exploring how to give a lot of our internal applications, things like our internal CDN, a lot more intelligence around the network, we ended up using OpenDaylight a lot more as the starting point for those experiments. And I've always felt that it's very important for any open source project to be well represented by its end users. And OpenDaylight is one of those strange projects where it started from a place that wasn't its end users. It was, broadly speaking, mostly vendors that started it. So unlike many of the other projects you see out there, say Apache HTTP server or OpenStack, it's very well represented by end users. So having done all this work and bumping into Neela last year, who suggested that they're going to start this advisory group and would I like to join. Given the amount of time and enthusiasm we had for the project, it seemed like a natural fit for us. And it's been a very rewarding experience hearing the other people who are using the project and the ways they're using it, which are different from the way we're using it in some cases. Some of our peers on the advisory group are the likes of PayPal and eBay, for example. They have very different uses from a service provider network such as ours. I think that's very good for the community as a whole, and I'm very, very happy that the advisory group exists now.
Great. Christos.
Yes.
I know you represent Orange, and Orange obviously is like AT&T, a global company. So what are some of the things that motivated Orange for investing?
Let me first of all say that I'm really happy to be back after a year and a half. I was last year here talking on NAV, and I'm really happy to see how the community has grown in terms of contributions and commits, and it seems that everybody's embracing the open source and OpenSDN and OpenDaylight. So from our perspective, when OpenDaylight launched like 2.5 years ago, we immediately identified there was a critical piece missing from this initiative. That was the end users and the end users' voice when it comes to providing feedback, because at the end of the day, it's going to be us, the operators or other service providers are going to be the end users and then the recipients of OpenDaylight. So we've been in contact with Neela and said that we want to be part of this community. I've been working on SDN for 5+ years. We started with experiment with OpenFlow early on and working with NEC, in fact, back in 2010. So we identified that this is very, very critical to us. We talked to a number of vendors, we worked with a number of vendors, and we also identified that OpenDaylight has become the sort of the de facto platform for OpenSDN. So, I mean, for us, it was very critical to join this effort, especially the advisory group.
Okay, thanks. And Chris, you represent CableLabs, which is another form of an industry group itself. So what's CableLabs' motivation for being part of this advisory group?
Yes. Well, we started researching SDN and NFV back in 2012. And we started with a number of use cases and trying to figure out how do we virtualize the cable access network. And specifically, the DOCSIS cable modem termination systems, the CMTSs. One of the challenges we had is none of them supported OpenFlow, none of them supported SDN protocols, but they did support a protocol called Packet Cable Multimedia, which was an old protocol that we developed maybe 10 years ago for QoS. About that time, OpenDaylight was started, and it had a key innovation, which was the service abstraction layer, the SAL. We wanted to see if we could virtualize the CMTSs using the SAL and creating a packet cable multimedia plugin. And so I gave my developer a challenge. The benefit of SDN is supposed to be speed of development, so you have 6 weeks, give me something that works. And he did.
He did it? 6 weeks, right?
6 weeks,
okay.
From nothing to a working prototype. We found that working with OpenDaylight, we can keep up this 6-week cycle time. So we use this as a platform for our virtual CPE prototypes as well. And again, we can meet this 6-week cycle time. When we took our PCMM plugin to one of the trade shows, we got just a ton of excitement from the vendor community and from the service providers. And so we wanted to give it back to the OpenDaylight community. We started a project within OpenDaylight, again, to see how welcoming the community would be for outside contributions. And we were very impressed with how welcoming everybody was. So we brought it in for the first time in the Helium release and just updated it again for Lithium. Based on our experience, based on how well the platform has been working for us as a development platform, we wanted to give back and participate on the advisory committee.
Well, that's a great intro from everyone. So everyone's got good, positive experiences. One of the things I'm going to open up some questions now. So I'm going to pick on different panelists for different questions. Obviously, we're talking here about, as an analyst, and I'm sure many of you are interested in proof of concepts, but field trials. Where are you applying, ODL, or how is open source making an impact I'm going to start with Chris Luke from Comcast. What are you learning from those experiences working with open source? And it could be OpenDaylight if you have an example, but share with folks here.
That's a really broad question. We can start with some of our very apparent successes at open source. One of our big projects we've worked with is obviously OpenStack, and we have a very large now deployment of OpenStack. I think we've got about half of the country deployed with that. And we have quite a large team in Reston, Virginia, whose focus is very much OpenStack, working with the community and the operations and maintenance of that platform. We are quite excited that the team that's doing that is 30-some people. It's not huge. And that's, I think, one of the key messages that certainly that division of the company is using, is saying, look, open source works. We can do this. You don't need a massive development organization to do it. More to the point, if you do bring a large development organization, you're probably going to miss the benefits because you spend more time managing than doing. So another area that we've spent a bunch of time on is our internal CDN was based on an Apache project, their content director. And it had some gaps, so there was some internal development to do that. A few months ago, they dumped the code on GitHub, our internal code for stitching our internal CDN together. Again, that's another small group based out of our Denver office. And they feel that by trying to build a small community around that, they can get more back. It's that rule that I've heard several people say, is that the more you put into open source, you get an order of magnitude back from it.
Was that true with the OpenStack example too?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. It wasn't just Comcast, that 30-man person team, it was...
Some of the work we've contributed to OpenStack has been around some of our more esoteric network requirements of our legacy network, things like DSCP marking, stuff like that, stuff that nobody else needs. Yep. And initially, there was very little traction because nobody else needed it. But over time, as more people have got into a more network-focused use for OpenStack, some of those more esoteric things are resonating with more groups.
Right.
So it is not instant, but you get there.
Yeah, that's great. Margaret, how about you from AT&T? You gave us a kind of preview earlier when you introduced it, that you have some of those examples. Can you talk about maybe even network on demand or something, that's being deployed more than just under development? Field trials or service deployments or
we're also a heavy OpenStack user, not a super user, but if you went to the OpenStack conference, but we are a user, so I guess we're a recipient of it. In network on demand, for the folks who might be familiar with the service, it's a service where you can instantiate network services on demand. And we have this, like Al had said, a CPE device where now you can instantiate different VNFs. So if you can imagine that whole thing when he showed that slide, we have a master service orchestrator, which is an open source Then we use OpenStack as the cloud orchestrator, which of course is open source. And then we use our SDN controller, our global controller, which of course is based on OpenDaylight, which is open source. And we found, well, when we were deciding to do our SDN controller, we had to decide, do we build it, everything ourselves? Do we go with a vendor? Do we buy, and so forth? We decided to build it ourselves, and then we looked out. In fact, Brian was the one that did the whole purview of, what's out there. And that's when we, I think ODL was just starting out, and we liked the framework that ODL had. And so it jump-started us. And so the community is very vibrant. It's a great platform. We're finding that the things that we were very interested in propagating, like Yang NetConf models, the whole abstraction, a model-driven abstraction layer, which of course they started with an ADSAL, which we realized was not the path. We always started with a model-driven. And then the concept of adapters, it matched so much like what we had already architected ourselves that we realized all we had to do was start using it. Obviously, it was nascent, in some sense, parts of it is, but it was such a similar framework to what we were doing that we realized all we had to do was encourage the ecosystem as we were doing our own development, and then we would feed back to it, because this is pretty germane, and we're having more and more discussions of how much of what we're building we should put back into the community. So definitely I think the open source in general has jump-started us everywhere. I mean, OpenStack, can you imagine doing that from scratch? Right?
So let's, everything we've heard is really good. There's always the other side of the story. Like, what are the challenges? We heard, I think, Dawn, and I've heard it from other service providers, organizational and cultural challenges. So Christos, maybe you can share with me, I mean, you have, Orange is, again, a global company. How is transforming or moving to open source been challenging for Orange? Has it been challenging? Have you some examples? Right. There have been bumps along the way?
Right. So obviously for us, open source is something which is new. We definitely embrace it, but obviously we come from different perspectives than the over-the-top players like Amazon or Facebook and Google, where they started with open source just to drive the cost down. So for us, this is definitely something new. And although there's going to be certain challenges, one of them is going to be how you can operationalize that, how you integrate these new platforms, this open source software into your current systems and services. And also, that means there's going to be some definitely significant cultural change in terms of how you have to train your personnel, your staff. Maybe some of them will have to depart. And also, that also signifies a shift from a NetOps model to a DevOps model that you actually mentioned. So that's one challenge. Another challenge that I personally see is that you have to make it definitely carrier grade. And we are coming from a carrier grade environment. It doesn't mean that we have to have the 5 nines reliability when it comes to open source, but at least it has to be close to that. But to me, my main concern is that how you make how you sanitize essentially open source. How do you make sure it's sanitized? So that means when it comes to security, compliance, obviously as telcos, we're very big on compliance, and also how you make sure that it's scalable. And at the end of the day, who's going to be doing that type of testing? That's going to be that's a big question mark for me. Okay, who's going to be making sure that it is carrier grade? Because here you have a community, so you have a number of people contributing to this open source, but you definitely need a third-party facility that's going to say, yeah, this is definitely carrier grade. I put my rubber stamp on that, and you can go ahead and use that in your network.
OPNFV is going to do that.
Yes, so that's one part of the whole picture. And the other thing is, as I said, we've been working with OpenFlow since the early days, and the what used to be called the Knox controller, which came out of Stanford, and there were other controllers in the meantime, the Floodlight and so forth. So what we discovered, and the reason I mentioned that here is that as you change environments, as things can break down. So we want to make sure that when we use the hydrogen and then the helium and then the lithium controllers, that these are backwards compatible some way. Because if you start developing applications in one particular environment, you want to make sure that you can continue deploying and using those application services as you get new updates and new releases for the open source. And that might be a challenge. So you want to make sure that it doesn't break down. And if it does break down, who's going to fix it? to me, that's the one of the.
So
challenges.
you brought, Margaret, I know you brought up OpenNFV.
OPNFV.
And one of the questions I have, and I'm sure many people in the audience ask, I ask it all the time, is there are many of you and are involved in multiple standards organizations involving open source, as I listed some of them on the slide. How are you guys, and I'm going to start with Chris because, how are you rationalizing or deciding where do you put your effort in and investment? Effort in terms of technical resource and then your corporate investment, where is that, how do you justify that and what's the role of each of these in, not going into all the details, but prioritization of that is really what I want to see what the panelists have to think about that. Chris, give you the first shot at that.
So my mandate is everything between layer 2 and layer 6. So Metro Ethernet, IPv6, SDN, and NFV projects within CableLabs. And as you can imagine, we're involved with a number of different standards and open source organizations. We participate actively in MEF, in IETF, OPNFV, OpenDaylight, and OpenStack.
You've got a lot of, you're juggling a lot there.
Yes.
You yourself, I know, are involved in a lot of these yourself.
Yes, I have a relatively small team, and we have to play with a number of these communities, and there's a role for each of them. One of the ways that we've found, since we are a small team, we are looking for leverage and how can we work together with the community to accomplish things. I think everybody these days is really willing to work together. I'll give you an example of one of the projects where we're working
that would
upstream.
Be great. Yeah.
And it's our virtual CPE project.
Okay.
We have just started a project within OPNFV called Connectivity Services LSO. LSO is part of the MEF vision, and we've been developing APIs and data models based on MEF specifications to provision virtual CPE devices. We've done our prototyping on top of OpenDaylight. So of course we want to bring the code that we've done into...
So OpenDaylight will be the controlling mechanism for that environment?
We're partly, and then partly into OpenStack as well.
Okay.
So we have gone to MEF with our contributions. We have gone to OPNFV. We are proposing a new project within OpenDaylight and bringing all these groups together to work on the code in one place.
So it's really a solution, and that's what I was kind of leading to, and I'm going to ask Margaret to sort of add to that. I mean, that's what I think I see as an analyst, is we're missing actual use cases and solutions that sometimes bring 2 or 3 of these different things that you described into eventually into a real world service. That would be, with virtual CPE would be one of those.
Right. This is a case where many hands make light work.
Right.
And working together can deliver this into the marketplace much faster than any organization working on their own.
Margaret, I know you have something to say on this topic if you want to add to that in terms of the role of multiple, the interplay of the groups, but how do you make that the prioritization of investing in some of these different open
Well, it comes down to what we view as strategic. I mean, I hate using that term, or things that we're in the middle of trying to make work, because we're rolling out. We're no longer doing slideware and vision. We're like trying to execute, and we're hitting everything. I mean, the comment about backward compatibility as you go from one release to another is a problem.
Yep.
I mean, we hit it here on ODL, right? When you went from ADSAL to MDSAL, right? There's certain drivers that were like stuck on one side or another and broken things, and so that is a challenge. The other is, when you're in these open communities, you have customers or users all over the place of what they want, what's important. So that's a challenge. So we put effort in the open source communities that we need to get more out of, I would say. And priorities might be different, so we need to get more active to make sure that our priorities are also handled. So the one area that I know a lot of the networking folks have a problem with is the networking side, right? On OpenStack, the whole Neutron. I mean, it's just, especially if we're heavily into layer 3, layer 2 VPN, BGP, MPLS, and it just doesn't work. It's so Ethernet layer 2 focus, and to try to tweak it for layer 3 is like a mess. So that's a big challenge. So we're going to be putting more and more effort in all these communities. And the vision, the reason why we decided to get involved in OPNFV was for exactly that reason. Every open source project or consortium had their little focus and bent, but we as end users, we can't just use one. We need the whole thing to work. And when we're sort of like, you know, whatever's the weakest part of that wheel is then how weak the whole platform is. Because they're not all like little pieces. They're all actually big chunks. So the goal of OPNFV is trying to at least pull together the use cases which drives all of these pieces together and to shake it out. And so hopefully, I mean, we only just started, you know, we'll get that traction. But the more I look at this, I know people are worried about OPNFV sometimes about, you know, what are we doing, what are we providing, you know, how quick and so forth. But, you know, if you look at what we are doing over and over again, we're all trying to put all these pieces together. And there is no other organization that puts all these pieces together. I mean, you name one, there is none. And then if you start going down, I know this is maybe not the right place, but as you evolve with all these different controllers, right, that might not be ODL and so forth, we're still then going to be trying to pull them all together end to end. And there is still, again, no place to do it. So I am really adamant that we need more end users to participate. We don't need money. We just need people to participate, to help create the use cases, to work with us on priority of use cases, and just help us just flush things out to figure out what works and doesn't work.
That was one of my, and I know we're going to be running out of time, one of my big questions too, and I'll open this up to all of you, is, I mean, ODL has created this mechanism, this advisory group, which I think is not all the other groups have done that, maybe at this point in time. So I want to get your perspective and advice that you guys can give to any of the other people that in the audience here who are interested in participating, or you know, I'm not sure what the mechanism is for the advisory group, but at least getting involved more actively. So, Chris, you want to start?
Well, I mean, the short thing is that if anyone's interested in participating, whether it's an existing project or something that doesn't exist yet, get on and do it. That's the big thing about open source. Just get on and do it.
Yeah.
There's no magic wand here.
Right.
If you have an idea, contribute it, and the community will give you feedback about direction or if it sucks.
Yeah.
Now, I was going to add, you know, these user groups, because people are desperate for have users get involved. You don't have to pay for anything.
Right.
Totally.
Yeah.
Like I said, my big thing is we need end user representation in open source.
Yep.
That's how it's going to succeed.
Yep.
In fact, I mean, I know we ran out of time, but you know, the ISGNFE that got started on Etsy, there was just 5 of us. Orange actually hosted the meeting. Just 5 of us at our own different levels, not asking permission from our corporation, our officers, our bosses. We just got together, realizing we need to gather together because we were all doing the same thing over and over again, and we wanted to share information. And we never dreamt in our wildest dreams when just the 5 of us got together that it would just turn everything upside down, and that would be this huge groundswell that's happened the next, like 2 to 3 years later. Never.
Yeah. And I think that's, you know, obviously that's great. That's a very important point. I think that's what it's all about, people. And whether you work for a vendor, service provider, cloud provider, startup, you know, I think we're in a very interesting time. Looking forward to seeing and hearing more about what you guys do. And I don't know if we have any time for questions, but I know we've extended the time.
Can I add one quick
Christos,
thing about OPNFV is that one of the reasons also we started OPNFV is that to provide that feedback to standards, because to me, like standards work, which is really great, and we have to rely on that, looks like exercise on paper today. Right. So unless you materialize that and it starts running, and the open source is the only way you can see things in action and provide that feedback back to the standard and say, this thing works, this thing doesn't work, maybe you have to go back and recalibrate that. So that's very, very important to us, and that's why we're like getting involved in open source more and more, I think.
Well, one very quick suggestion I have is if we have people here who don't know how to broach a topic and maybe they're not very technical, the advisory group can be that buffer perhaps. Come talk to us. You recognize us now. We're on stage.
Yeah.
And we happen to know the TSC and so on, so we can help translate some of your requirements perhaps. I'm not saying this is our official capacity, but I think we're all willing to help.
Don't be shy.
Yeah. Come talk to us and also try to work with us as well. We
Totally.
need to collaborate more and you know.
I want to thank the 4 panelists and for all the work they've been doing. You guys are a catalyst for the industry, and look forward to hearing more about what you guys do and the successes, and some of us, and even some of the things that you go through, the hardships are important. It's not going to be, it's a journey, not a not a destination, right? So thank you to all the panelists. What Android has done, where 84% of smartphone, according to IDC, have operating systems running Android. You've got big data and what Hadoop has done. Lots of research we've done, over 33% of big data apps are being developed using Hadoop. And then you've got what Facebook and Yahoo and a lot of the companies here in the Valley have created and been using open source for a number of years, Google as well, in the social media world. And finally, if we look into cloud, which kind of touches into networking, and that's an interesting convergence point. As an analyst, I cover that kind of what we call the meet-me points, whether you call it the data center or the convergence of IT and networking. Very, very hot area, very disruptive area. And that's why many of you are here. And OpenStack is playing a key role. I think over 90% of a lot of enterprises are using OpenStack already. It remains to be seen whether it's a platform of choice in the telecom world. So we're entering this application and infrastructure innovation or disruption, and you can see from these slides, we're moving from a horizontal approach to a software-defined model. We're moving towards infrastructure. Why do we need to depend? Next couple of slides. The storage area has also been going through a lot of transformation. So the key thing here to look at is that as all of this is changing, the networking is, and sometimes people joke and say we're the last to be moving towards this open source, but I think we have the most profound impact, especially because of all the mobile infrastructure, the Internet of Things, everything that's dependent on the network has a huge impact on everything else. And then, I thought I'd put this up. Certainly, a lot of this has to do with the DevOps culture. A lot of my colleagues at IDC cover IT infrastructure. DevOps in the enterprise is really taking off in a lot of companies, not just large corporations, even mid-sized companies. And this whole agile development approach is also the timing of open source initiatives, as long as agile development, I think is a good opportunity. OpenStack, again, a lot of activity going on with many of you involved, I'm sure, here. Whether that will become a platform of choice for telco cloud deployments. And then you have other examples. There's many vendors, some of you in the room. Obviously, Brocade was one that I listed here as one of infrastructure. As Don Blackburn from AT&T correctly said, well, why do I need to depend on the product life cycles of a lot of the traditional vendors? So you're moving into that thing. Why not develop as a community and move into that? Well, object-oriented APIs have made that transformation a lot easier. And you have all these open source initiatives. OpenDaylight is a key one of those, but you have lots of others, and I'll show a couple of examples. So if you look at it, you look at where we are in the middle here, the networking layer, you've got a lot of open source activities that have been going on for a number of years. Obviously, at the compute layer, where a lot of this started, you had Linux, you have OpenPower, OpenCPU. I'm not going to go into this. You have now newer things even in this area, like containers that Neela mentioned and what Docker is doing with Google. And then in the networking layer, this is where many of us have seen this huge transformation over the last 2 or 3 years, where we have OpenDaylight, OpenFlow, we have OpenNFV, we have Open vSwitch. There's a lot of different examples. And it's really important that, and in the storage, you'll see some survey data I have here in the We have to my immediate left Chris Donley from CableLabs. So welcome, Chris. We've got Chris Luke from Comcast. And we've got Margaret Chiosi from AT&T. And Christos Kolias from Orange, Silicon Valley. I've had the pleasure of working with some of these folks prior to being an analyst, being involved with standards over my career with the MEF, IETF, ATM Forum, Frame Relay Forum, so I'm dating myself. But in any case, it's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to an interactive session with the four panelists. So we've got some questions for them, and hopefully there'll be a little time for you folks to ask some questions. So what we'll do is I'll just give you, like I said, a quick perspective, and then, we'll open it up to the panelists. I have some questions for them, and there'll be opportunities, hopefully, for you guys to ask some questions as well. So let's, if any of you familiar with IDC, you may have heard of us, but we have been talking about the third platform in the ICT space for many years. For the last few years, we went from the mainframe to the distributed client-server model to, the apps world. And I thought it would be useful to kind of put in perspective, the four pillars that we talk about in the third platform: mobility, cloud, social media, and big data. And if you look at all of these, there's some great examples of the role of open source. Obviously, a lot of us are familiar with